Okay, so we left off talking about the High Renaissance, right? This is this culmination of what we've been talking about so far that started with Giotto, and the idea of a early, proto-early and High Renaissance. It was something that even the people of Renaissance identified, right? So Giorgio Vasari, who we've talked about a number of times, who wrote the lives of the most eminent artists of the Renaissance, identified Giotto as the beginning, right? Identified sort of the infancy of the, or the early maturity of the Renaissance, being around Masaccio, Donatello, and that it had come to its full fruition, right? Its full adulthood, if you will, during the period of Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael, right? So this is the High Renaissance, this idea that it's developed to sort of this apogee, right? This height of sophistication in the early 16th century. We hadn't got to Raphael yet, but Raphael arrives in Florence. He was born kind of in the hill country outside of Florence, a smaller town. Comes to Florence because Florence is the epicenter of the Renaissance at this point. And he arrives 1505, right at the same time that Leonardo and Michelangelo are working on some of their most famous works. And he gets there at almost exactly the time that Michelangelo leaves, right? Remember that Michelangelo was working in Florence where he was born, and in 1505 he is summoned by the Pope to go work on these projects in Rome, right? Take his talent there and work for Pope Julius II, right? Who's rebuilding Rome. That's where we left off, right? He's torn down St. Peter's Cathedral and he's going to rebuild it, right? He's got the Sistine Chapel he wants Michelangelo to do, and the whole point that Michelangelo goes in the first place is this monster tomb project, right? So he's got this idea to sort of rebuild Rome in this extraordinary fashion, and Michelangelo is summoned in 1505, right? Right at the exact same time that Raphael arrives, and that means really when Raphael gets to Florence, Michelangelo's not in the picture, right? And what we can see when we look at Raphael's period in Florence is that he's very much influenced by Leonardo, because Leonardo is the established older master in town, right? And so we have a wonderful Raphael collection. We have like 5 Raphaels. We're very lucky that way. And any one of them is better than the one they have up in New York, right? We're just an extraordinary collection. And this is, I don't know, we have 2 that I think are particularly wonderful, and this is one of them. And you can see if you look at it, at first it's the first good baby Jesus we've ever seen, right? It's a baby Jesus that looks like a baby, not like a little man, right? So there's that. He's pudgy, he's cute, right? He's squirmy on his mother's lap. There's something kind of realistic about it. But if we look at her and the interaction between them, we look at her costume as well, you'll notice that wispy veil that she's wearing, right? And notice how underneath Jesus' arm it sort of swirls around. That's a Leonardo thing, isn't it? Look at the veils that come over her shoulders on the Mona Lisa, right? These sort of swirling veils. And there's a number of things we could point to where Raphael has really picked up on what Leonardo's doing. Even this image of the Madonna in front of the wall, right, looks very much like Leonardo's portrait. It's the same sort of, a little bit longer, we get a bit more knee at the bottom, right? But it's very similar in sort of layout of this. And then the landscape behind it that sort of amplifies the scene. Now the wall in the front certainly could relate to the idea of the enclosed garden we talked about, right? The metaphor for the Virgin Mary that Fra Angelico used, which is the idea that her virginity sort of symbolized through an enclosure, right? So she's in front of a wall with the world on the other side of it. We can certainly talk about that. Doesn't really work for the portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the Mona Lisa, because it's not a religious image. But if we look at the landscape behind it, if we look past the wall, we start to see what's different about Raphael and Leonardo. Some things he's picking up. Some things are particularly Raphael. He's a much cleaner painter. A much more obvious painter. Leonardo loves to obscure things, right? To make them somewhat mysterious. To make you complete it in your mind rather than Leonardo completing it on the panel, right? Raphael, there's very imagination. Everything is spotlit, clear, there's no sfumato lighting. Everything is kind of clean as we move back into the landscape. We see little figures walking on the paths, right? We can clearly distinguish plant forms and where they start and stop, right? There's none of that strange sort of emerging and submerging that we get with Leonardo. I always kind of refer to Raphael as Leonardo light. You know, he's getting it. He understands some of the things Leonardo's doing, but he's painting a much more straightforward conception of those ideas without sort of diving into these things that make Leonardo so eternally fascinating, right? I like Raphael well enough, but I find him on a certain level something of a sponge when he moves around. I mean that kind of in the best possible way. That when he moves from city to city, he'll pick up on who's there, right? So when he's in Florence, Leonardo's all the rage, and he picks up some things from Leonardo. And the idea, of course, is he's working for a market. And that market has been established by the presence of Leonardo da Vinci. So he's going to pick up elements that makes his works more valuable to the market, more attractive to buyers. But he's not going to try to mimic him entirely. He's going to instead create these images that say something particular about Raphael, right? So the colors are brighter. The landscapes don't have as there's some atmosphere in the background. And as we get to the deepest hills, he does like 17 of these for the open market while he's in Florence. He's in Florence for about 3 years, right? And there are 17 of these that survive. He may have done a lot more, right? They may have been lost to time. And they're all, a lot of Madonna and Child. There's a huge market for these in Florence. Remember Botticelli, right? Fra Filippo Lippi doing these images of the Madonna and Child. There's people want these for their houses, right? To aid in their prayers. And Raphael's tapping that market. So 17 different versions. We've got 2 from his Florentine period of the 17 in the National Gallery, right? There's another one up in the Walters Museum. Here's another of the same, very similar to some Leonardo compositions. In fact, this is very close to a Leonardo composition. But as we move back into the background, we have bridges, we have water, we have the same sort of gentle moving back into the landscape, but it doesn't have that mysterious sfumato lighting or strange rock formations that look as if the earth is sort of becoming in front of our very eyes. Right? It's all clean and clearly laid out, and that's typical for Raphael. Cardellino is the Italian word for the little bird in his hand, right? So, a number of versions of these while he's in Florence, okay? In 1508, after being there for roughly 3 years, he too gets a summons from the Pope, right? So Michelangelo's already been down in Florence for, 3 years. And in 1508, the Pope sends another summons Michelangelo had been in Rome for 3 years. 3 years later, the Pope sends a summons to Raphael. I want you to come and work for me as well. And what Julius is doing, Pope Julius is doing, is he's assembling really the greatest of the great to come and work for him. I think he wants Leonardo, but he doesn't get him for maybe a couple months. It's not his thing, right? Working for the Pope is not his thing. He's much more of a secular kind of fellow. But he gets Raphael because he's got ideas, Julius does, for projects that Michelangelo simply can't do, right? He's got more ideas than any one artist could carry through. And that's even the case when we look at Michelangelo, right? He keeps pulling them off of one thing, sticking them on another project, because he's got a lot of ideas, Julius does, the Pope. He wants to rebuild Rome. And so he gets Raphael to come and work for him as well, right? Now this on the left is the basis of one of the worksheets, right? This is the Pope's private suite of rooms, right? And it's literally adjacent to the Sistine Chapel. Now, if you ever go to the Vatican, they feed you through this on your way to that, right? And they're both just hideously crowded all the time, right? 4 sets of rooms, or 4 adjoining rooms, that were the Pope's private, we call them the papal apartments, right? And it's not like it's a 2-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 2-bath sort of thing, right? It's his rooms. They are apart from the rest, right? That's what we mean by apartment. And you can tell the scale by the doorway in the corner, right? The massive rooms. And this room was his library, right? Where he kept the books he would need in order to review and sign any papal proclamations, right? Where he would go back and he would have to look up things in order to then sign off on new canon law, right? And so each of the four walls highlights one of the four categories of books that he kept: poetry, law, philosophy, and theology, right? And Raphael's frescoes give us the authors of these different categories. So in our view on the left is poetry. And on the right is philosophy. And behind us, we can't see it, is theology and law, right? And you have to imagine that originally in the middle of this was a bunch of bookshelves, places to sit and read. And it's called the Stanza della Signatura, the room of the signatures, right? This is where he would sign papal law. And the images on the wall relate to the books that were in the room that gave him the knowledge he needed, right, in order to do this. The School of Athens is the nickname that's been given to the painting on the right, shows all of the philosophers of the ancient world gathered together. Now, these philosophers lived in different centuries, but that doesn't matter to Raphael. He has gathered all of the greatest minds together in one space. Right? So they're centered in the middle on Aristotle and Plato, the two most famous philosophers of ancient Greece. They lived about 100 years apart, but there they are together. Right? He's gathered them together. And this is a metaphor in a way for what Julius is trying to do in Rome. He's gathering the greatest minds of the world together in one place. Michelangelo and Raphael for us in our history, right? Numerous other scholars, philosophers, and so forth. The building in the School of Athens is based on St. Peter's as it looked at the time, right? So remember that we talked about this last class. The original St. Peter's is this building here, built under Emperor Constantine around 300 AD, right, 320 AD. And he's building over the top of it a much more massive structure. Eventually we'll tear this thing down, right? And the building is incomplete because the dome hasn't gone on the top of it yet, that Michelangelo would design 30 years later. And this open work barrel vault that you see is exactly the basis for the architecture in Raphael's painting. So he's made the painting attractive to Julius II. Right? It's his building project under which all of these philosophers have been gathered. A couple things that the online things don't tell you. The statues in the background, this is Apollo on the left, Athena on the right. Apollo, the body is a rough translation of some of the works that Michelangelo is planning for the tomb of Julius. This would have also been very attractive to Julius II, right? To have these figures reappear. Online, we talked about the fact that a number of the philosophers have the features of contemporary people. Raphael appears in the upper right here, right? Self-portrait of him as one of these ancient philosophers. Down, leaning over, the bald guy with the bozo haircut, right? That's the architect of the Church of St. Peter's. His name is Bramante. I think this is on the worksheet, right? In the middle of it all, and not part of the original plan, is a portrait of Michelangelo. We know this because Michelangelo was a pain in the ass, pardon my French, right? Remember Leonardo, everybody wanted Leonardo around all the time? Michelangelo got in fights with everybody. He had just a difficult relationships with everybody that he ever worked for. He apparently was just irascible. It was really difficult. And when he was hanging out at the Medici Palace in the 1480s, right, he was part of that Neoplatonic academy that Lorenzo de' Medici ran when he was a teenager. When he was hanging out there, he got in a fist fight with another artist, and the other artist broke his nose, right? Literally had a crooked, bent nose from having been bapped when he was a teenager, and there he is with his broken nose, right? And we know from numerous other portraits, this is him. He's leaning on a block of only partly cut stone, which is typical for where he is at the time. He's working on the Julius tomb. He's not going to get it finished, right? And the story is that if we look at all of the drawings that Raphael made for the School of Athens, none of them have this figure. It's not in any of the prep drawings for this, where the others do all appear. And he sticks him in at the end. And the question is why? And if we look at him, not only is he sort of isolated in that empty space, right? But the body type, look how big he is. Look at those legs, right? It's like a rugby player. You know, he's just massively sort of built, heavy and monumental. And the story is that he put him here because Raphael snuck into the Sistine Chapel while Michelangelo was working. He was very secretive, didn't want anybody to see it. Right? And one night, Vasari tells us, this great story, about how Raphael's working a wall away, right? Sneaks into the Sistine Chapel, crawls up on the scaffolding. Holy moly! Look at this. Nobody's seen anything like this before. Comes back in, and in homage to Michelangelo, includes him in the painting, looking like one of his figures from the ceiling. Right? And it's much more athletic. It's much more burly. Right? Raphael is changing his style based on his contact with Michelangelo. And so while Raphael was in Florence, he was deeply influenced by Leonardo. Now that he's in Rome, Leonardo's not there. And Raphael becomes deeply influenced by Michelangelo. Right? Raphael the sponge. Right? He's able to pick up good parts from what other people are doing and make them into part of his own style. Right? And we begin to see that here while working for the Pope. Now, Raphael also continues to work for private patrons. He's not only working for the Pope. Right? As an artist, he's got lots of people for whom he's working. And he continues to make images of the Madonna and Child for the open market that someone would buy after he painted it, although they may well have been commissioned. Here we see the round form that we talked about before, the tondo form. Remember that? From the Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi, Adoration of the Magi picture that the National Gallery also has. Remember that round pictures were intended as gifts based on the older practice, the medieval practice of giving a silver plate as a gift to commemorate a childbirth. Round paintings replaced those in the 15th and 16th century. And so when we see one of these, we should remember that they're intended as probably as childbirth gifts. And this one makes sense as well because we have Mary with the infant Jesus on her lap and little John the Baptist next to him. Right? So nice theme for a birth gift, for a tondo. Right? And made perhaps for the open market, certainly not for the Pope. Right? It's called the Alba Madonna, based on a later owner of the piece. Right? The Alba family owned this. And we can see as we look at her, the way she dominates the landscape. She's this sort of pyramid of solidity with the grouping. And how she's sort of so much more dominant than the background behind her that she's very similar in her solidity, in her monumentality, in her bigness to Michelangelo figures. And Raphael is showing very much his debt to that experience of having seen this new style that Michelangelo's working out on the Sistine ceiling, and brings those ideas into the Alba Madonna. Again, typical for Raphael, landscape still very clean, very easy to read. Everything very, very well lit. No sfumato lighting, right? Everything's clean and clear and pretty much straightforward. Right? With that, let's try to read the picture. So we've got Jesus on the lap of the Virgin Mary. Unlike Leonardo, there's no sort of confusion, right? We talked about the Madonna of the Rocks and which one's Christ and which one's the Baptist, and it's kind of difficult, right? Raphael gives us halos. They're subtle, but they're there, right, in perspective. And he gives us other signs as to which child is which. John the Baptist always carries a reed cross, a cross made from reeds, like this, or sticks. So that helps to identify him on the left. John the Baptist also always wears a hair shirt. It's like a fur, right? And the hair shirt was a fur, but worn wrong way out, so that instead of getting the fur, which is soft against your skin, you get the other side of the hide, which has all the ends of the hairs against your skin. And that makes it uncomfortable, right? Itchy, like a wool shirt. Itchy. Right? And the point was that for the Baptist, this made him uncomfortable in his flesh, and reminding that there's more to life than being comfortable, right? But there's a spiritual world out there as well. So the hair shirt also identifies John the Baptist. So it's very clear in identifying who is who. And John the Baptist is supposed to be 6 months old. He's good at that too, isn't he? He's really good with babies, right? These are really cute, and there's an age difference. Subtle, but there's an age difference, right? And as we look at what's going on in the picture, Raphael kind of complicates it more than that. Because you'll notice that Jesus has one, he's got his hip, his proper left leg, his left arm, are resting very solidly on the lap of the Virgin. But his proper right leg, on your left, is stepping onto the ground. So Raphael has captured this very particular moment where Jesus is leaving the lap of the Virgin. He's stepping away from her and out into the world. And that's the theme that Raphael's trying to develop with this picture, is he's moving out to his mission. He's moving out into the world. So he's stepping away from the protection of the Virgin Mary. Aha, the blue, right? The blue of not only royalty, but the blue of faithfulness to his mission. And he's about now to go and fulfill his mission. And what does he do? The first thing he does is he puts his foot on the ground. He reaches out and he grabs the cross. That little fake cross that the Baptist has, that's a symbol of his prophecy of the Messiah. And it is Christ accepting his fate as he steps out into the world. And the Virgin Mary is looking directly at it. And she's looking not at any particular point, she's looking at the point where he will hang on the cross. The place where the two meats come together is the focus of her gaze. And she's not looking in fear, right? She's looking in acceptance. Right? She is faithful to his cause. And that theme is wrapped up within this image. She's letting him step off. She knows he's got to do this. Any real mother would do everything she could to protect him, knowing what would happen. But she realizes that she has to let it happen for the good of mankind, and that's the theme that Raphael's playing with in this picture. So it's really, even though a very simple picture, it's filled with a lot of symbolism. Insofar as, and the symbolisms are played through the actions of the figures within the work. Now, to wrap up the High Renaissance, I want to look at Venice. We started talking about Florence, which was the epicenter of the Renaissance. And then we saw those artists all shift to Rome. Right? There's another major economic center that we haven't talked about in class at all, and that's in the city of Venice. Venice is in northern Italy, right on the ocean. You probably know this, the canals and whatnot, right? And there's a strong artistic scene in Venice that's very, very different from the Renaissance as it appears in Florence and later in Rome. So Giorgione is the first artist we'll look at. Who's working on this? So There's lots of stuff out there on this, right? And we're going to barely scratch the surface. Make sure with your paper you don't quote me because I'm quoting other people, right? I'm not a Giorgione scholar. Right? One of the things that's fascinating about Venice as we look at Venetian painting, right, is the way in which the sort of symmetry and balance of Renaissance art, that thing geometry that we've been talking about, it is different in Venice. So if we think about Raphael's Alba Madonna, we look at it, she's this pyramid, she's this triangle of a composition, right? We can begin to trace sort of geometric figures over the top of this. And we have less of that in Giorgione. So for example, if we traced a sort of a geometric underscoring of the composition for Raphael's Alba Madonna, it would look something like that, right? It encompasses the entire figure, it comes to a pinnacle at her head, it balances it, it stabilizes it, makes it symmetrical. If we try to do something similar in Giorgione's, we're kind of at a loss, right? If we could, it's a right triangle maybe, with things leading up to Joseph and Mary on the far right. They're not the center of the composition. They've been pushed off to the side. Right? And in doing that, who becomes the center of the composition for Giorgione? Right? It's the shepherds, not the Virgin and Joseph and the child. They have been totally kicked off to the right side. And again, if we bisect the compositions, if we draw a line right through the center of the two compositions, right, in the Alba Madonna, that center is the Virgin Mary. Right? That's the focus, that's the centerpiece of the composition. In Giorgione, the centerpiece is the shepherds. And as we look at this symmetry, right, or lack thereof, in Raphael's, the left and right sides have a certain balance in the background as well. Sort of continues across. What you see on the left, you see a mirror rug more or less on the right. It's not exact, that would be boring, right? But here, with this centerpiece, we see that half of the composition is just landscape, right? That you could actually paint the entire composition if you wanted to, all the major players in half of the picture. The other half is just there. It's just background to fill it up. It's fully given over to this extensive landscape that we see moving into the background. And that's a hallmark of what we find in Venetian painting, is an interest in landscape, particularly rural landscapes. And it's something we find not only in Venetian painting, but we find it in Venetian literature as well, is this interest in landscape. The dominant kind of literature that we find coming out of Venice are poems that are set in the countryside. Poems that talk about the beauty of the landscape, the simplicity of the peasant lifestyle, of the shepherd's lifestyle. It's a kind of poetry we call pastoral poetry. And in many of these Venetian poems, they link the landscape, the life of the shepherd, right? Life of the farmer. They link it to ancient Greek and Roman literature as well. There was a whole trend of this in ancient Rome, of literature that talked about the countryside. And what it talked about was how the countryside was a necessary and important antidote to life in the city. Why do we go camping? You know, what's the point of pitching a tent and putting out a Coleman lantern? You know, being cold all the time. It's because something about getting back to nature is a great antidote if you live in an urban environment. You know, it recharges your batteries. You become aware of what's necessary, what's not necessary, etc., etc. The poems from Venice that talk about this drew an analogy between the countryside, where the peasants lived, and the ancient Roman myth of Arcadia. Arcadia was a land in Roman mythology where time had stood still, where progress had not invaded on tradition, where people never grew old, where everything was better. Giorgione, like the poets, is focusing on something that's kind of like an Arcadia back there. A world where progress doesn't truly invade every part of it, that focuses on the lives of the peasants. So as we look back into the landscape behind our two focal peasants in the foreground, we see more people, right? There's a couple by the tree right behind them. There's another one sitting in the hut on the left. You barely see it on the shoreline. Right by those rocks, there's a couple of figures there as well. Right? It invites us into this rural landscape, and we see the very edge of the city. Right? We're outside of that. We've left the urban environment behind. It's back there, but it's sort of tucked off to the side, and we're beyond that. We've moved out of the city. So there's this interest in rural activities and rural life, and this was incredibly popular in Venice in the Renaissance, and particularly in the 16th century. We have lots of examples of pastoral poetry. Part of this is because of the nature of Venice. Venice is an intensely urban environment because it's a man-made island, right? There was this archipelago out there, a bunch of little sort of sandy things, and in the 7th, 8th century, they drove pilings into the ground and built the city on top of it. That means there are no tree-lined avenues. Right? There are no public parks. Right? It's buildings everywhere. They're beautiful, but it's buildings everywhere. And it's separated from the land. It's a Google map, so it's modern, but so we see that the industrial spread is taking part in the landscape. But Giorgione's painting is sort of set here, right? Outside of Venice, which would have been attractive. There's hills and greenery and rivers, right? In a city that floats on the ocean. That gives this an incredible amount of fascination. And from the worksheet on Giorgione, one of the things comes up is their interest in mood. As we get into the landscape, we notice that not only do we have these sort of nifty details with a lot of atmospheric perspective, not sfumato, but there still is a, humid haze of sorts. But notice the degree to which Giorgione is able to capture the essence of light at a particular time of day. This is sunset, right? Look at how the light is striking that clock tower from the side. You notice the clock tower's in ruins as well, right? City's no good. Countryside good, right? And we have these clouds sort of drifting across the sky, either a gathering or a parting storm. Some of the sunset light yellowing the sky as the clouds open up. And the light is sort of slowly drifting in on these buildings in the background. Right? Very moody kind of landscape being established by Giorgione, but a very natural kind of fall of light at a particular time of day. Have we seen much in the way of particular times of day in artists' renderings? Not much, right? Certainly no night scenes yet. Right? And nothing that's definable as an evening scene as much as this one is. But what's fascinating about that light in the background is the degree to which it's different than the light in the foreground. So read the picture closely. Take a look at it. We got this horizontal sunset light coming across that bay and illuminating the different buildings from the left, right? And coming in very low. Now look at the light that's falling on the Holy Family and the shepherds. And you see that it's coming from a different source. It's coming from above. And as we look more closely, you'll notice in the upper left corner here that if this light's coming in this direction, right? What's lighting that tree? That's the direction of the light that's falling on the now. So the tree is lit from a different source than the sun, right? And as we look in the background, these guys are looking at it. They're looking at that separate source of light. Oops, sorry about that. And as we look up there, there's an angel bearing the message, right? Leading them to worship Christ. And it's the angel that's illuminating the tree, right? The light that's coming onto the tree from this side is coming from this angel. It's the same light that pools around the shepherds here. It's not the same light as in the background. So that's a theme we've seen before. worked out in different ways. Where the holy light of Christ, right? The holy light of divinity is stronger than natural lights on earth. And in this case, Giorgione gives us two very separate paths of light. One that falls naturally in the background, one that falls supernaturally in the foreground. And that's to enhance the meaning of the scene, but he does it through landscape. One of Giorgione's pupils was the painter Titian. Worked under Giorgione. Giorgione died very young, 37-ish or so, in 1510. Giorgione dies. Titian had studied under him, and some of his works are so close to works by Giorgione that people still debate who painted it. This one's gone back and forth, but anymore we think Titian. Notice the same interest, the varnish is much more yellow on this, but notice the same interest in atmosphere and mood. Created by the clouds, the lighting, the landscape. Notice also the same interest in rural themes, right? Countryside themes. Here we are away from the city again, with buildings lit from the side in the background that establish our separation from the city. Right? We're away from urban civilization. We've moved off into the countryside. And as we look at the picture and read it more closely and understand what's going on here, we find that it's kind of a strange thing. What's this guy doing playing the lute with these two naked women? Right? How do we read the image? What's going on here? Right? First thing we have to do is pay attention to the ones that have clothes and what the clothes mean when we look at them. Right? So let's look at those two guys in the middle. They're dressed differently, right? One on the left in red, one on the right, brown, foppy hat, two-tone tights, right? The fellow on the left is dressed like a professional musician from Venice, right? A member of a professional musician society. We know that from the clothing. We know that from various historical sources. So he's a member of the urban world who has gone off here to the countryside. He's out of his element. Now, the fellow that he's sitting next to is a peasant. He's a farmer, a shepherd. And we know that from how he's dressed. There's another figure dressed exactly like him in the background with a herd of sheep. So they're sort of looking at each other rather closely. They're sitting like sportscaster close, right, to each other, uncomfortably close. But the theme that Titian's working with is that the fellow playing the lute has gone off to the countryside for inspiration. He's looking to the landscape around him to inform his art, right, and his art of the song. So by listening to the shepherd, by meeting with the shepherd, he's inspired to compose a song. And that fits perfectly with what we've seen with Venetian art, what we talked about with Venetian poetry. They look to the countryside for inspiration, away from the dense urban environment of Venice. So that's the theme that Titian is working with here. He's gone off to the countryside to fill his mind with ideas, the basis for his music. Now, what do we do with the women? Who are they? Any ideas at all? Who are they, and why are the guys not paying any attention to them? Again, look at what they're doing, right? The one on the right has a pipe. She's been playing a song. The one on the left is either drawing water out of the well or pouring water into the well. It's not really clear. What is a well a symbol for? Life, exactly, the water of life. We've talked about that a number of times. The well of Moses, right, was the water of life. It sustains us. Anything else we can think of? What about it like an ink well? source of inspiration, source of ideas. Right? What we think is going on with the two women is that they are embodiments of the inspiration itself. That the figure who's drawing water from a well or adding water into the well, it doesn't really matter, they both work, is the idea of adding to our ideas. Right? That's the concept she embodies. The figure playing the flute, right, is the song that the musician hears in his head. And they've been given human form, which is something we see a lot when we look back at ancient Roman art. And would account for why the guys aren't looking at them, because they're not physically there. Right? They're embodiments of concepts. They're embodiments of ideas here in the countryside. So our musician, like Titian, has gone out to the countryside for inspiration, to learn something different and bring those ideas back as a sort of visual vacation, if you will, to someone in the city. Okay? And tying together the ideas of art and music and poetry all wrapped up in one. In around 1519 or so, Titian became employed by a duke in a nearby town, the Duke of Ferrara. I don't know if I have his name coming up in a box or not, the Duke of Ferrara, to do a series of pictures of frolicking in the countryside, right? All based on Roman mythology. They do a series of 4 pictures, right? And in this case, it's a group of people on the island of Andros, the Andrians, who were followers of Bacchus, and they are reveling here on their island. Bacchus performed a miracle, and the rivers on the island flowed with wine, so the people were perpetually drunk. And this is not seen as a negative thing. They're, after all, frolicking in the landscape, enjoying the rural countryside for what it can provide for them. And we see the figure holding up the wine, I guess he's looking for silk, right? In the bottom. In the center, that sets the theme, but wine pouring everywhere. Musicians down below, a couple of women with pipes again. Sheet music in the foreground, dancing. Fellow in the back, shot, right? Dead drunk on the hill. Woman in the foreground, that really points to the fact that this is extraordinarily erotic, right? With both of these scenes, we are, for the first time in this class, nowhere near Christianity, right? I mean, there's no way to play with these images and begin to see any kind of Christian overtone in them. These are images about sensual pleasure. By that I mean using your senses, right? Hearing song. Some people have gotten all Freudian with the Pastoral Symphony on the left and talked about the fact that she's holding that pipe right there. You know, that there's a strong erotic overtone to these. And with the Bacchanal of the Andrians, it's really obvious with the figure in the corner, right? Right behind her, a little Bacchanalian baby tipped over last night and peeing into the river, right in front of her, right behind her, right in front of us. These are overtly secular scenes for the first time in the Renaissance. But part of that development I've been talking about, right? What was the interest in Rome? It started off with realism. It moved to Roman body types. Then it moves to Roman themes. And that's where we're at here. So Titian was called in to paint these for the Duke of Ferrara. And it was a commission to complete, trying to change slides, there we go, complete some pictures that had been begun around 1510. So we've got one of the series down at the National Gallery, right? The Duke of Ferrara commissioned this he commissioned the best artists of the day in around 1510 to complete a series of pictures for his study in his palace. And the walls of the study were carved out of alabaster, which is kind of like agate. And these paintings would have been set within that, right? And this is the place where he would sit and read. And the only artist that got any of it done was Bellini, Giovanni Bellini, who finished this just before he died in 1514. Okay? The rest of it sat unfinished until 1519, when the Duke hires Titian to complete the series. Okay? So Titian's Bacchanal was made to go with this picture. Right? And Titian had studied under Bellini at one point, for a very short time, had been a pupil of Bellini, and so he made a perfect choice for this big commission. Right? And you'll notice the composition, we have these figures arranged, they're a bit more dynamic in Titian, they're moving in and out of space rather than sort of sitting across this flat. But the placement of the nude woman in the corner ties the composition together, right? Which is the theme over here in Bellini's work as well. Right? So Titian is called upon by the Duke to complete this series. He does 3 other paintings, and he comes back and he actually paints the background of Bellini's to match the background of his. We have an x-ray of this, and originally that's what Bellini's looked like. There was a row of trees behind the figures. Right? This is now the black and white x-ray of it. And what Titian did is he came back over it and he painted it in a way to add a sort of moody, atmospheric landscape, which is the same as the landscape in his own works. So that's why this was painted on 2 different occasions. It began in 1514 and then finished like in 1529. And if we put them the way they were originally meant to be hung, you can see that it makes a continuous landscape across the 2. Right? That the figure, the sunlight in the upper left corner picks up on the sunlight on that drunken figure on the left. And again, Duke Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, there's his name showing up finally. This commission for Titian cemented his reputation as the foremost painter of eroticized mythological scenes in all of Europe. And he worked for courts everywhere who were collecting his works that wanted works similar to this. Right? He worked for the Holy Roman Emperor in Spain, did a series of pictures, he called them his poems, of Roman gods in love. Right? For the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor, in return, knighted Titian and made it retroactive for his family generations back. Right? Great honor given to Titian for his talent. And he ended up through the rest of his career working often, not always, but often on mythological scenes that have an erotic overtone. Who's working on this? Someone in classes. The Titian, I didn't print it out, maybe they're not here today. Right? But here is Venus in the bathroom, if you will, in her toilet. By toilet, we mean makeup room, right? Having made herself up to be beautiful, the goddess of love, and she's been also eroticized. Now, Titian painted a great number of versions of this, but we know from records that this one was in his collection when he died. He kept this one for himself. And we think that this was the basis for all the other ones. That when someone wanted a Venus from this was a showpiece. I made something like this one. And would then do a variation of it for different painters around. Right? But there's a market for these things as we move into the 16th century. A market for images of Venus that seem to have lost all of the Neoplatonic connections to the Virgin Mary. It's just Venus as a naked woman. Venus as an eroticized female body. Right? That's exactly what this is working on. The pose is the same as Botticelli's, right? Only she's seen in half length and seated, but still has one hand over her breast, one hand over her crotch, right? Now has brought up some fur to cover that. But it goes back to the same ancient statue type that Botticelli had used, and there are lots of examples of this out there. Right? 2 last slides and then we'll quit. She's been making herself beautiful because she's the goddess of love. She's going to go out and do her work, and in order to do her work, she has to be beautiful. So we get to look in on this sort of private practice of Venus prettifying herself, right? And Cupid is holding up a mirror so she can look. And I love how the mirror just picks up that one eyeball looking out, right? But she's admiring her own beauty. She's doing what you do as a viewer. admiring her beauty, right? And if that's the overall theme that Titian is trying to get across, he's going to try to make the flesh and everything about the picture as beautiful as possible, insofar as the tastes of the day are concerned. So she's slightly larger than the modern conception or ideal of beauty. That's the norm for the Renaissance. And what Titian does is he makes every aspect of it about as beautiful as he can, whether it's the pearls in her hair or these fabrics that she has. This fur that has the embroidered exterior, or that red velvet covering, blanket that she has over her legs, are just extraordinarily palpable, right? And in addition to that, the way that Titian presents this as an object. So paintings have two characteristics, right? One is that it's a subject matter, okay? One element of painting is that it's Venus and Cupid in her boudoir, right? That's one element. But on the other element, it's an object, right? It's a bunch of pigment on a canvas. That's the other element. So we got these two different identities of the painting, right? And with Titian, I think there's an awareness of making not only the subject matter beautiful, but making the object nature of the picture beautiful as paint on a canvas. And one of the things that Titian does throughout his career is to work with leaving brush strokes fresh and unblended. Look at the highlights on the red. And you can see how he laid the paint down. And what that does subconsciously is it makes you aware that not only are you looking at Venus with this beautiful sort of voluminous fabric, right, but you're also looking at this surface with paint on it. Right? And he even highlights the skin. Look at the wonderful amount of glue that's in her elbow. Right? That he's bringing color into it in a way that we haven't really seen. That each part of those colors sort of blends together in your eye and makes it sort of more stunning as an object. And what we'll see, and this, we'll quit with this, is that this makes Titian an incredibly popular painter with other painters. Right? As we move out of the Renaissance and into later periods, we're going to see that you can't go 20 years without somebody hitting on Titian and going, that's the answer to everything I've been trying to do. Right? He's one of the most important and influential painters of the Renaissance for his ability to paint. Right? Sorry I kept you 2 minutes late. We'll move on to Northern Renaissance.